Right, this is probably the least interesting video on YouTube, but heck, it needs to be done. So what we're going to look at today is how to tackle the sources in your mock paper. So let's go. Your mock. Your mock is going to be on the liberal reforms. Hopefully that's not a surprise to you. You've been given a revision guide and some flashcards to use to help you out. It will have 6 questions on the mock. All of them are source based. And generally, the rule is you must use your own knowledge as well as the sources in your answers. So every single question, when it asks you a question, you're going to be using the source, you're going to quote the source or describe the source if it's a picture, and you're going to use your own knowledge to back it up. You have to get source information in there and your own knowledge. You must. Literally all of your answers. So every single answer, you'll be describing your source and you must be using your own knowledge as well. The sources will be both written and visual. You might have a poster, you might have a cartoon, and you'll probably have written sources from newspapers or from books and speeches and things. Finally, you must use the sources and your own knowledge in each question. Cannot emphasize that enough. For top marks, you'll be looking for both knowledge and your use of the sources. Okay? Right. So what I'll do is I'll walk you through a sample paper. Now this sample paper is on Britain during World War One. Obviously ours is not on Britain during World War One, it's on the liberal reforms, but I thought I'll give you another example, and so we'll look at this one. So the first question you're going to get in your paper, you'll definitely get, first question is, what is the message of this? And it'll either be a poster or a cartoon or something. In this case, in my example one, it's what is the message of this poster? Use details from the source and your own knowledge to explain your answer. Right, now ordinarily this source is in colour. I don't know why it's in black and white, but yeah, not to worry. So, key points we need to look out for. Message. What's the message of this source? That's what we're going to be looking for, and we're going to be writing that down first in our answer. Where's the evidence in the source to back that up? So, describe the source, prove that that is the message by describing the source. What contextual knowledge do we know? Which also proves that that is the message. And lastly, we need to reword the message just to make sure we've got the message down, because you can't go beyond a few marks unless you have the message. So you need to make sure you reword that message too. So when you get a source like this, you probably think, well, where do I start? The place to start always is down there in the bottom with the italics. Where's this picture come from? Who's written it, or who drew it? In this case, this is a picture from, or a poster from the government in 1915. Now that 1915 number is super important. We'll come back to that in a bit, but that's going to help you massively. So, what else can we get from the source? Any bits of writing, read those as well on the source, obviously. This is just adding to extra evidence for our answers. And again, you can quote the source. So if it's a poster, feel free to quote what's written on there if it's going to back up your point. So, what's the message of this source? The message of the source, and you probably remember this, the message of the source is that men would feel guilty if they chose not to contribute to the war effort by signing up to fight. So, if the men didn't choose to sign up to fight, they should feel guilty in the future. That is the message of the source, and the key word here is guilt. The guy should feel guilty. Now, how do we know that? Well, we've got to look at the detail from the source. And there's lots of detail in this source to help back that up. In fact, I found 4 bits. So first of all, we got the guy looking a bit pensive, a little bit, I should feel a bit guilty about this. And the reason why is presumably his daughter is asking him, well, Daddy, what did you do during the Great War? So it looks like she's interested in war because she's reading a book about it. And she stopped reading to ask him that question. So she's interested in war and she's asked him that question. His son is on the floor, also in the picture, and look what he's playing with. He's playing with toy soldiers. So clearly the kid's interested, the boy's interested in war as well. So that will help us in finding, backing up that from the source. So the message of the source is that men would feel guilty if they chose not to contribute to the war by signing up to fight. This is supported by the source as a girl is asking her father what he did during the war. He looks pretty guilty when the question is posed. Clearly his children respect those who were involved, adding to his guilt. This is supported by the tagline, what did you do in the Great War? I forgot an end quote. But yeah, make sure you include both quotes. This is quite a nice source, a really good source. I love this source because it's quite easy to kind of pull out the message and then find evidence to back it up. In terms of the own knowledge, with sources like this, and with most sources to be fair, when you're talking about own knowledge, you're looking at what happened at that time, because remember, it's contextual knowledge, and contextual means relevant. So you need to be talking about stuff that happened at that time. So one we're looking at here was in 1915. So when you'll be sitting in your exam, you'll be judging back through your memory, thinking, oh, 1915, what was going on during 1915? The main things are volunteering drops massively in 1915. And because volunteering drops hugely, so less people are volunteering to join the war effort, less people are volunteering to join the army in particular, that causes the government a big problem. And so in December 1915, it's the lowest month for recruitment, and it kind of makes sense. It's cold, it's wet, people want to enjoy Christmas at home, so fewer people are signing up to fight for the war. And it's because of that in January 1916, we get the conscription, which we'll talk about a bit later on. So in 1915, we can understand why this source has been created. Is because it's desperately trying to drive up numbers of people wanting to fight in the war. So it's desperately trying to increase recruitment, and so that's why it's been published there. So a reminder, the key points: make sure you put your message in there. The message of this source is. You use the source, find details in the source to back up that idea of what the message is, and use your own contextual knowledge, and then, as I haven't done in this, but reword that message. The message is so important. Just spend 20 seconds rewording it, just so you definitely got it nailed down. If you finished your assessment, so you finish your mock exam, and you realise, oh, I've got 5 minutes left, the one thing you should do is check to make sure you've reworded your sources from the what is the message ones in particular. So go back, do a little star, and reword it just to make sure that you've got it. All right, what's the next question? Why do these two letters show different attitudes towards Germany? Right, so we're looking at, particularly with this kind of question, why do these two letters show different attitudes? We're looking at where these letters came from. And that's going to give us a huge clue as to why they have different attitudes. So what we're going to talk about in this, we've got to explain both sources. You have to talk about both sources to get full marks. Again, you've got to use the sources, so you have to quote them. If relevant, discuss the tone or the language that's being used. Now that sounds like an English kind of essay, but when it comes to sources, some of them can get quite emotive. And if they're really emotional, then it might not be all that reliable. Maybe they're too emotional. So sometimes it's well worth looking for tone and language. And of course, like we said with the other ones, you've got to bring in your own knowledge. And if you can, when you're doing comparison, try and link the sources together. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. So let's look at where these sources came from. The first one is published in a Yorkshire newspaper. Well, that's really important. We'll talk about that a bit more in a second. And the second one was written by a suffrage leader, Mrs. Sennett. So the first source, let's focus on that one to begin with. It's published in a Yorkshire newspaper. Now, hopefully, you'll remember that right at the beginning of the war, Britain, the British Parliament, passes the Defence of the Realm Act, or DORA. And one of the key things about DORA was that it denied the press the freedom of press that it usually has, and said, actually, no, in wartime, we've got to make sure that we are controlling what the press say. They can't go out saying negative things. And so when we have letters like this in newspapers, they're not doing it to try and show the bad side of war. They're using it to try and increase spirits, raise morale. So actually, whenever we have a letter published in the newspaper, we know immediately that this isn't going to be a letter criticising the war effort, because newspapers weren't allowed to publish stuff that was negative about the war effort. So right from the get-go, we know this isn't going to be a negative thing about the war, before you even read the source. So let's see what he says. Having seen the work of the enemy ruin towns and villages, and the wholesale murder of helpless women and children, that's talk about tone and language, that's a very emotive little statement there. The Germans are murdering helpless women and children. So his attitude to Germany is one of, they're quite barbaric. This guy who's fighting on the front line is talking about the Germans being very barbaric, and that perhaps shouldn't surprise us. The guy who's fighting against the Germans, he's going to want to say horrible things about them because they're the enemy. So what's his attitude towards the war? It's quite barbaric. It's terrible. So we could talk about that in our answer. I've gone for a slightly different take. Source B is propaganda to boost morale. Working hard and helpless women and children are good examples of that, and I mentioned that in your answer. And in our own knowledge, well, Dora ensured that newspapers could not print negative stories about the war effort. Therefore, it's not surprising that when it publishes a letter from the front line, it's going to be talking about how terrible the Germans are. We should all be fighting against them. Everyone should be involved in the war effort. And of course, it's like I say, it's a very negative attitude towards Germany because the guy's fighting Germans, and so we shouldn't be surprised by that at all. So the first source, source B, very, very negative on Germany, and that's to be expected. Source C is less so. Women have suffered so terribly because of the cruelty of the government. It does not care about the inhuman conditions it has forced on our suffering working women. Consequently, even if the Germans invaded England, we could not see things worse than we see today. After all, British women are outlaws in their own land, and they could be no worse off under German rule. Now, that's quite a stark contrast to the first source, because she's saying, well, actually, why not let the Germans invade? Because let's be honest, us British women, we're not being respected by our government. Maybe the Germans wouldn't actually be that much worse. A key part here is definitely if the Germans invaded, England would not see worse things than we see today. Now that very line there is a huge contrast to the previous source. The previous source saying they're terrible, terrible people, the Germans, so cruel, killing helpless women in particular and children. And I think I make the point the other days that it's very strange that we've got these two sources, one from a woman and the other one talking about the treatment of women, and they seem to be at such odds. They seem to be disagreeing with each other hugely. So in our answer to this question, we explained the first source, now we need to explain the second source. Highlight as well the British women are outlaws in their own land, and link that into what we know. So source C shows a different attitude, as it is written by a suffragette looking to further her cause. Whilst many suffragettes supported the war effort, some didn't, and the most famous one is Sylvia Pankhurst, who continued the suffragette cause into World War I. So we've got a question here, is why do these two letters show different attitudes towards Germany? Well, the key thing there is purpose. What's the purpose of them? And that's going to be quite a common thing you need to be asking yourself during this mock is, what is the purpose of this source? Why was it made? The purpose of the source B is to try and encourage the war effort, to try and encourage people signing up to fight for the war or to sign up to work in factories and things. In source C, the purpose is completely different. It is to complain about the government. To complain that British women are outlaws in their own land is obviously a reference to the fact they don't have the vote. So they're essentially like outlaws. So what do we need to do? That reminder, explain both sources, which we've just done. Quote both sources. Always quote the source. You must quote the source because it's worth points. It's worth marks if you do. Discuss the tone and language used. Include your own knowledge. And if you can, link the two sources. And you're golden and you've got everything you need. So when you ask to compare two sources, there's going to be things that are, there's going to be links in them. There's going to be similarities and there are going to be differences. You need to pounce on those and explain them. Right, here's another comparison one. Which source do you trust more as evidence about British government control of propaganda during World War I? Now this is a really interesting question because the first source, source D, is a document from the German War Ministry. So we're looking at the italics first again. It's from the Germans. So in this British paper, we're looking at a German source. The second one is a private comment by David Lloyd George, who's the Prime Minister at the time. So let's start with the first source, source D. Well, actually, let's talk about key points first. Explain both sources. Again, we talked about that in the previous one. Quote both sources. Discuss the tone and language used. And again, bring in your own knowledge. Okay. Let's zoom in. Right, so source D. Recently, a film about the Battle of the Somme was shown in England. The film, made by the British government, emphasises English bravery and minimises our efforts. It has enjoyed enormous success with the English public and is an actual, genuinely truthful war film. This has a powerful impact on people. Consequently, we must respond and produce our own film, presumably called With Our Heroes on the Somme. So this German War Ministry memo is arguing actually the British had created this film, and the film was actually called The Battle of the Somme, imaginatively titled. The Germans have seen the British have done that and thought, actually, that's a really good idea. We should create our own film to raise morale at home, to get people going, yes, well done, Germany. So, key sort of bits to pick out from this. The source says that the film has enjoyed enormous success with the British public. Now, remember the question. The question is asking, which source do you trust the most? Now, with source D, it says the film has enjoyed enormous success with the British public, or the English public. It did. And we know that's true because hopefully, using our own knowledge, we know that about 7 million people went to see the film. Many people went more than once. It's a superbly popular film, and it's a real boon for the British government. The film was so popular, and so it must have raised morale of people in England to want to go back to see it again and again and again. And the Germans say it's a generally true for war film. Now, this we should be able to believe too, because remember, there's two sides in the Battle of the Somme. So the Germans are saying, actually, yeah, that film was pretty realistic, it was pretty accurate. Well, they should know, they were there. So there's 2 points here that we can put out and say, yeah, this is actually quite a reliable source, even though it's from the Germans, and it's asking us which we find, which one do we trust the most? Well, actually, the German one, it's got a bit of evidence that we agree with. We can say, yeah, we know that lots of people went to see the Battle of the Somme film, and secondly, they're describing it as a generally truthful war film. Well, yeah, they were there, so that kind of makes sense. So what will my answer be? Well, something along the lines of, Source D is trustworthy because it correctly states that the film Battle of the Somme enjoyed enormous success. It was watched by millions of people and impressed soldiers who were actually there. By wanting to replicate the film, it implies that the British were successful at controlling propaganda, and therefore we should trust it. What about Source E? Now, Source E is an interesting one because, like I say, it's the private comment. It's a comment said by David Lloyd George that was written later on afterwards. So that makes it an interesting source. The particular bit, I'll read the whole thing. I spoke last night to a war journalist about the war. He gave me the most impressive and moving description of what war was on the Let me start that again. He gave the most impressive and moving description of what war on the Western Front really means. If the public really knew what war was like, it would be stopped tomorrow. But of course they don't, and can't know. The censors will not allow newspapers to publish the truth. What newspapers describe is not war, but just a pretty picture of the war. So again, this is a private comment by David Lloyd George. So hopefully, if you're wondering about which source do you trust the most, you jump in on something that you already know, that you can say, yeah, I know that's true, so therefore I agree with it. And when he says the censors will not allow newspapers to publish the truth, well, we know that's true. We've already said that DORA, the Defence of the Realm Act, forbid newspapers from publishing gloomy stories about the war. They had to be really positive, and therefore the truth about deaths and the nature of people dying, being blown apart, was kept away from the British public. So we agree with David Lloyd George here. The newspapers, we know for a fact, weren't allowed to publish necessarily the truth, the whole truth. And so we can say this source is reliable because we know that, because we agree with him because we have that extra knowledge. All it's painting is just a pretty picture of the war. And that's quite an emotive thing to say. He's making the point there that it's not just censorship, it's propaganda in newspapers. If it was censorship, it would just deny what was actually happening. It would just block out things. But by saying newspapers are just producing a pretty picture of the war, they're obviously saying lies. They must be being creative in their lies to encourage people to see the war as this pretty picture. So my answer. In contrast, Source E was a private comment by Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister of England at this point, and so would therefore know the extent of government control over propaganda. It makes sense, he's the Prime Minister. He correctly recognises that the censors will not allow newspapers to publish the truth since DORA restricted their powers. Overall, I'd probably argue that Source E was more reliable, more trustworthy than Source D because it's a British source written by a man who was in the know, who was in the inner circle of the government, so would know exactly what's going on in terms of propaganda. Whereas the German one, although it is reliable, doesn't have that insider knowledge. Okay. Right, so what do we do with these sources? Lastly, just a reminder, we explain both sides. We use quotes to back them up. We discuss the tone or language if necessary, and we use our own knowledge as well. Okay, right. A poster. You usually get two picture sources in an exam. Not always, but you usually do. So this one's a slightly different one to the one we saw at the beginning of the exam, because the first one we said was, what's the message of the source? This one's asking, why was this poster issued by the government in 1917? The key thing here is not message, it's not asking for what the message of the source is, it's asking us why it was created in 1917. What was the purpose of it? Why did someone decide, I need to make this? So whenever you see a question that says, why was this poster issued? Or why was this cartoon made? Think about the purpose. Why did someone sit down to make this? So, key points. What's the purpose? Where in the source can we prove that? So again, look for evidence in the source to back that up. What contextual knowledge do we have that can add to that can also prove this is the purpose of the source? And like with message before, we reword the purpose at the end. So let's have a look at this source. Right, first of all, that date, key at the bottom, it's 1917. And that's the key question. Why was this issued in 1917? So hopefully you're racking your brain. What do I know about 1916, 1917, and the build up to this poster being made? There's a couple of things to look out for in the poster itself. We've got the woman in the foreground, clearly putting her coat on like she's just about, or overalls like she's just about to start work. And that line at the top, these women are doing their bit. There's that chap in the background as well, which we'll talk about in a second. So, looking at this, it looks like this poster was issued in 1917 to encourage women to join the war effort. It is putting moral pressure on women who see the poster to suggest that if they're not doing their bit, that's a quote from the top bit, if they're not doing their bit, they should feel guilty as other women are. In this case, it's suggesting that women learn to make munitions. So there is the source, there's the purpose, and there's the source description to back it up. Now we need our contextual knowledge. Now, hopefully this will bring some alarm bells to you. 1917, aha, this is after conscription of 1916. Lots of people have been fighting in the war now because they're being forced to because of conscription. There have been some pretty bloody battles. Battle of the Somme was in July 1916. It goes on till November, so loads of people die in that. You can understand why they keep calling out more and more people to fight in the front line. Therefore, that's going to lead to shortages of people working in the factory and places like that. So our contextual knowledge. In 1917, there was a need for more women to join the war effort as more and more men were being conscripted into the army after the Conscription Act in January 1916. This is highlighted in the source by the man leaving to fight the war. So the man is leaving the factory. I'm done here, I'm afraid. I've got to go and fight. Women are replacing him. And that's what this poster is trying to show. And that is the purpose, is trying to convince women to do their bit. So remember, when we get a question like this, what is the purpose of the source? What point is there? Remember, the question is, why was the poster issued by the government in 1917? Well, what was the point? Evidence in the source, your own knowledge to back that up, and then reword that purpose. Right. The ending one. Now, I love this question because it's easy marks. The last question you'll get, and now it's slightly different in the actual exam you're taking this summer, but don't worry, we'll talk about that beforehand. But in this paper, which is a bit older, but it's fine, the skills are still the same. In this paper, you'll get a question that says, study all the sources. And then it'll give you a question or statement. The statement here is, government propaganda failed to convince the British public to support the war. Now, how far do the sources support that statement? So you'll get a broad question, and you'll have to go back over the sources and try and find sources that support that statement and oppose that statement. Government propaganda failed to convince the British public to support the war. So let's go over some of those sources. Let's talk about technique first. This one I love because it's very much like our Key Stage 3 assessments. So you argue one side, then you argue the other, and then you analyse for full marks. So argue that the sources agree with the statement that the British government failed to win the public support for the war. Find sources to back that up and use your own knowledge. And then flip it and then talk about argues that they don't agree with that statement and actually the public did support the war effort, use sources and own knowledge to back that up. And then you do that analysis at the end. So, what sources could we use to look at? Well, first of all, here's a British government poster in 1915. The fact that the British government is still trying to get people to volunteer into the army in 1915 might be an argument that actually the British public weren't in favour of the war because not enough people are volunteering to fight in the army. So you could make the argument that, we could use this source to make the argument that actually, no, the British government did fail to get the support of the British public because, look, they're still doing recruitment posters in 1915. What about this other source? This was source B, I think. The British soldier's letter to his family. One was published in the newspaper. He says, he couldn't believe at the bottom, consequently, we were cruelly shocked when we received Monday's newspapers to see that South Wales miners had come out on strike. Now, the South Wales miners did go on strike. They were unhappy about their pay. And so you could argue, well, that's proof, therefore, that the government failed to get public support for the war. If miners were willing to go on strike, they weren't supporting the war effort, they were thinking about themselves and their own pay levels. So that's evidence, further evidence that the government did not win the public support. We'll come back to that source again later on as well. This source, these sources here, this disagrees. Looking at the arguments against, well, actually, source D says there was huge success with the Battle of the Somme film. The public went to see it. It was so good they wanted to create their own one. So clearly, the government must be winning the support of the public. Sort of the source E, the people don't know the realities of the war. And if people don't understand the realities of the war, they're only looking at that, and I quote, the pretty picture of the war, then clearly they must be doing something right. Because actually, a better line to underline would have been, if the public really knew what the war is like, it would have been stopped tomorrow. It would be stopped tomorrow. But the public didn't. So if that's true, Lloyd George is saying, the public don't know anything about the war. If they did, the war would be stopped tomorrow. Well, the public didn't demand the ending of the war. So actually, he must have had the support of the public. Going back to that soldier's letter, he does say, "I'm glad I joined up." It's not massively strong evidence, but you could use that quote to say, well, actually, people continued to volunteer for the war, even though it'd been going on between 1914 and 1918. That's 4 long years of war. People continued to sign up, and here's a guy who did just that. So maybe the government was successful in getting the support for the public. So when you get that last question, all you need to do, remember, is argue that some sources do agree with the statement, find sources and explain how that agrees with the statement. And again, use your own knowledge. Remember, you've got to use your own knowledge to back that up. And then find sources that don't agree with it, quote them, and use your own knowledge, and then do a bit of analysis at the end. Okay? Hopefully, that gives you everything you need to know to do very well in this assessment. Any problems, though, come and find me before that big Friday, and we'll have a chat. Brilliant. Cheers.